Welcome back. Their music is among Cuba's greatest exports, and through it the Buena Vista Social Club has gained fans worldwide. After more than 40 years of US sanctions, the musicians' unique rhythm embodies a distinct culture which has flourished in the island nation. All next week we'll have special coverage from Inside Cuba, and we begin tonight with Michael Voss's report on the Buena Vista Beat.
Cuban music is one of the attractions which draws so many visitors to this Caribbean island. Most popular of all, the traditional rhythms of the Buena Vista Social Club, made famous a decade ago with the award-winning film.
The success of the Buena Vista Social Club helped revitalise Cuban music, both at home and abroad. Now, without many of its original members, it's turned from a band into a brand.
The singer here is Felix Baloy, who featured on many of the original albums. These days he incorporates the name Buena Vista in his show. It's a surefire way to pull in the tourists.
This music is more popular outside of Cuba these days. This is such a musical country with so many different rhythms. Young people have gone their own way. You still hear it in Cuba, but for the rest of the world, Buena Vista remains the sound of Cuba.
Drummer Amadito Valdez is one of the younger members of the original band made famous by the film. Today, this 63-year-old still lives in the modest Havana apartment he grew up in. Like so many of the others, he carved out a successful international career with a band of his own, though the surviving members do get back together from time to time. His daughter Idania is touring Europe, singing with the official Buena Vista Social Club, one of a new generation of musicians helping fill the gaps.
I see the Buena Vista Social Club as a project. The band had a number of well-known figures who developed their own groups and orchestras. That's where you find Buena Vista these days. Some of these musicians are no longer with us, but their bands continue the tradition.
On any one night, there might be a Buena Vista Social Club playing in Plaza Vieja, another one playing somewhere in England.
What's happened is that since Buena Vista Social Club has been converted into a trademark which identifies Cuban music, a lot of promoters want to use the name to sell their products.
Omara Portuondo is one of the last of the original Buena Vista superstars. This 79-year-old diva recently returned from the United States, where her latest solo album won a Latin Grammy. She was the first Cuban musician to be granted a visa to perform there after President Obama eased restrictions on artistic exchanges. But can Buena Vista still be the same without her and so many of the other original members?
No, it hasn't changed. This type of music will always be with us. It's still the Buena Vista sound. Members of the band may change because some have passed away, but the spirit lives on.
And for the tourists paying to attend a Buena Vista concert, does it matter that it's not the band they saw in the movie or heard on the CD?
No, I don't think it really matters because the content is still there. And that's what matters, the music.
There's mortality, so people come and go. Like one of the famous groups from your country, the Beatles. I mean, not all the members are with us, but you know, music's music, and you know, I'm sure there's bands out there or musicians that have grown up listening to Buena Vista Social Club and embrace that music.
Much of the music has its roots in the 1940s and 50s. Buena Vista brought these golden oldies back to life, and there's no sign that these rhythms are about to fade away anytime soon. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana.
Coming up next week on BBC World News America, we'll have a series of special reports from Cuba, culminating in 2 nights of live programmes anchored from Havana by Matt Fry. The American and Cuban governments have been at odds for decades, but under all the icy rhetoric, might there be a thaw underway?
I think there is a disconnect from what you hear from the people and the politicians. I think the people are traveling much more to Cuba. I think the people are looking for ways to engage with Cuba.
There was an unprecedented statement of regret today from Cuban President Raul Castro over yesterday's death of a jailed dissident who had staged a long hunger strike. However, Castro denied any ill treatment of Orlando Zapata and blamed the US for his death. It's just the latest flare-up in the long battle between America and Cuba. And yet, despite that animosity, a new survey by the BBC and Harris poll shows that an overwhelming 3/4 of Americans think the relationship with the island nation is an important one. All this week, we're bringing you a series of special reports from Inside Cuba. Tonight, Michael Voss looks back at the past half-century full of contentious exchanges.
Few countries arouse such conflicting emotions as Cuba. Condemned by Washington as a repressive one-party state, admired by others as a champion of the poor, providing free healthcare and education. For years, Cuba was America's Caribbean playground, with its mafia-run gambling and nightclubs, all overseen by the corrupt US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The streets were packed with expensive new American cars. Those were boom times, and US influence was everywhere. The modern conflict between neighbors started in 1959, when Fidel Castro and his band of young, bearded guerrilla fighters, including the legendary Che Guevara, swept to power after leading an insurgency against Batista. Fidel set out to create a utopian society without private property, communism in America's backyard at the height of the Cold War. In its first year, the revolutionary government nationalized large farms, factories, banks and public utilities with little or no compensation. More than $1 billion of US property was seized. The US reacted by imposing a trade embargo, severely limiting commercial, economic and financial transactions in an effort to topple Castro's government. The tension escalated in 1961 as the CIA tried to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion using Cuban exiles. The effort was a disaster. The invading force was defeated, Washington humiliated. It threw Castro firmly into the arms of the Soviet Union, a relationship which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In 1962, US spy planes discovered the Russians installing ballistic missiles on Cuba. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. The Cuban Missile Crisis eventually ended after the Soviets backed down, with the US pledging not to invade the island. 1 million people have left Cuba since the revolution for the United States alone. Initially, it was the upper and middle classes. Later came the mass exodus of the Mariel boat lift, followed by other attempts to flee on makeshift rafts. These days, the US grants 20,000 visas a year. The new generation of Cubans are as much economic as political migrants. The embargo, almost 50 years on, remains in place, primarily from pressure by Cuban-American exiles whose votes are critical in swing state Florida. Food is one exception to the embargo, though Cuba must pay in cash for all imports as credit is forbidden. Today, the United States is the 5th largest exporter to Cuba. Despite financial pressures, the Cuban state has struck to socialist principles, though recent years have seen more private sector employment and some self-employment. In the absence of trade from the US, Cuba has found a new friend in China and strong support from Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, a major oil and gas exporter. The economy has also survived with the help of Canadian, European and Latin American investments, especially in tourism. 2.5 million visitors, predominantly from Canada and the European Union, flock to Cuba every year, generating revenue in the billions of dollars. But the money sent home by Cubans living abroad, many of them in the US city of Miami, is crucial to the economy. Fidel Castro survived numerous CIA assassination attempts and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had bankrolled his revolution. In the end, though, it was ill health which forced him to step down. Raúl took over the presidency in 2006, and many looked to see what changes he would bring. But under Raúl, the communist system has remained virtually unchanged.
With Barack Obama in the White House, relations have started to thaw. There are now direct talks on immigration and other issues, but the US continues to insist that there must be reforms before the trade embargo can be lifted. The old Cold War standoff shows no signs of ending soon. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana.
Welcome to Havana. It is extremely rare for a Western broadcaster to be allowed to go live from this city, and for us indeed to report on the colour and the complexity of this beguiling and fascinating country, as we've been able to do all week. Now, in the next few days, we're going to give you a fascinating tour of 21st century Cuba. In a way, you could say this is the Cuba post-Fidel. Now, of course, Fidel Castro, who started the revolution here in 1953, completed the revolution in 1959, who is the father of this nation, is still with us, both in body and in spirit. He is still the defining voice of this country. Well, Cathy, from the vantage point of the ordinary, or indeed extraordinary Cuban, the whole agonizing debate about health care in the United States seems somewhat quaint. In this country, for decades, they've been bragging about their free universal health care. And of course, they've been ridiculing America for the lack of it. Now, healthcare here is a source of pride, justifiably so, but it's also a tool of diplomacy. Here's our man in Havana, Michael Voss.
Fidel, Fidel, they cry, a familiar chant on this revolutionary island. But these are junior doctors and not one of them is Cuban. They come from across Latin America and the Caribbean. Now they're on their way to Haiti as part of Cuba's Emergency Assistance Brigade. They all graduated from the Latin American Medical School on the outskirts of Havana. There are 10,000 foreign students here, all on full scholarships paid for by the Cuban government.
I wouldn't have been able to become a doctor without my scholarship, because things back in St. Vincent, because of poverty and economical crisis and stuff, it's very hard to get, that set of money.
Most are from poor developing countries, though some come from underprivileged communities in the United States. What the Cubans ask in return is that once they graduate, they take their medical skills back home.
They teach us everything to become a general doctor, a good practitioner of medicine. The only one is they ask us morally, would you please go back to the community that needs you and practice it? There's no strings attached, It's just a moral one.
Paying for foreign medical students to come here is just one part of what's turning into a policy of health diplomacy. Cuba also sends tens of thousands of doctors to needy parts of the world while bringing hundreds of thousands of foreign patients here for eye surgery.
The Cubans call it Operation Miracle, free eye surgery for those in need. These international medical programs can't be cheap, but in political terms they are paying dividends. Every country in the region, bar the United States, has restored diplomatic ties. With a new generation of doctors singing their praises back home, healthcare has become a key factor in Cuba's battle for hearts and minds. Michael Voss, BBC News, Havana.
And I'll be back in just a minute from here in Havana on this special edition of BBC World News America.
Music is one of the attractions which draws so many visitors to this Caribbean island. Most popular of all, the traditional rhythms of the Buena Vista Social Club, made famous a decade ago with the award-winning film.
The success of the Buena Vista Social Club helped revitalise Cuban music, both at home and abroad. Now, without many of its original members, it's turned from a band into a brand.
The singer here singing with the official Buena Vista Social Club, one of a new generation of musicians helping fill the gaps.
I see the Buena Vista Social Club as a project. The band had a number of well-known figures who developed their own groups and orchestras. That's where you find Buena Vista these days. Some of these musicians are no longer with us, but their bands continue the tradition.
On any one night, there might be a Buena Vista Social Club playing in Plaza Vieja, another one playing somewhere in England.
Welcome back. Their music is among Cuba's greatest exports, and through it the Buena Vista Social Club has gained fans worldwide. After more than 40 years of US sanctions, the musicians' unique rhythm embodies a distinct culture which has flourished in the island nation. All next week we'll have special coverage from Inside Cuba, and we begin tonight with Michael Voss's report on the Buena Vista Beat.
Cuba is Felix Baloy, who featured on many of the original albums. These days he incorporates the name Buena Vista in his show. It's a surefire way to pull in the tourists.
This music is more popular outside of Cuba these days. This is such a musical country with so many different rhythms. Young people have gone their own way. You still hear it in Cuba, but for the rest of the world, Buena Vista remains the sound of Cuba.
Drummer Amadito Valdez is one of the younger members of the original band made famous by the film. Today, this 63-year-old still lives in the modest Havana apartment he grew up in. Like so many of the others, he carved out a successful international career with a band of his own, though the surviving members do get back together from time to time. His daughter Idania is touring Europe